Cranks. In true crime, they're everywhere. They're on podcasts. They're on YouTube. They're on TV, whenever they manage to go mainstream. They're on the shelves of your local secondhand bookstore. They're in the murder sheet's inbox. Yes, sometimes it seems like most of the world's cranks are in our inbox, clamoring in all caps under mysterious email addresses. They tell us that they know the truth. They alone can tell us the truth about the crimes we cover. They ask, are we ready for the truth? Like so many wannabe Jack Nicholsons, they're not sure if we can handle it. Today on the Murder Sheet, we're going to be talking about true crime cranks, their impact, and how we should all react to them. That will be the topic of our discussion in today's Offbeat chat episode. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is the Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're the Murder Sheet.
And this is Offbeat on true crime cranks.
So what are we talking about when we talk about cranks? It might be tempting to picture anyone who has a penchant for ranting or anyone who disagrees with conventionally accepted crime narratives as a crank. But that's not what we're talking about. We define true crime cranks as individuals who seem committed to peddling misinformation and false conspiracy theories.
To be clear, cranks are not all irredeemable people. Some may have underlying mental health struggles or unaddressed trauma. Conspiracy theories may be a coping mechanism for these folks, something to help them make sense of this vale of tears. Some may have never had the opportunity to learn to think critically, to rationally grapple with different ideas surrounding an issue in order to come to a conclusion. That is not to say that cranks are unintelligent as a whole. Sometimes you'll meet smart and even well-spoken people with terrific imaginations who, for whatever reason, just happen to be channeling all those gifts into spouting utter nonsense.
Other cranks are more insidious. They know there's money or power in their corner of crankdom. Their project doesn't have much of a hook, so they throw in a big alleged cover-up. They want to sell a book. They want to get on television. They want to convict or exonerate someone in the court of public opinion. They want to sick the mob on a person other than the defendant they're advocating for. They seem to especially like targeting families reeling from the accidental death or possible suicide of a loved one. They swoop in to just ask questions and convince those grieving that there must be a sinister explanation, a target to focus their anger and hurt on. Some of these cranks know better, but they're willing to gamble in order to hook a following, or access, or money.
Nobody is fully immune to the crank's siren song. We're sure that many of us have, at times, especially when we were younger, had a few crankish opinions, especially around topics that we cared deeply about. Off the top of our heads, we can think of 3 people whose careers morphed from respectable to crank adjacent while chasing a hot story. It happens. What's more, we've frankly found that the true crime community in general is susceptible to its own crankish patterns. Such patterns can include falling for slick defense talking points and accepting shaky innocence narratives despite available evidence, frequently throwing out unlikely and unrealistic sex trafficking scenarios in missing persons or stranger abduction cases, jumping to accusations of cover-ups or conspiracies in unsolved cases with little or no evidence, and uncritically believing surviving family members who, in their immense grief and shock, insist a probable suicide or accident must be a homicide. It's also worth saying that people who are cranks can certainly change for the better. People can find more worthwhile pursuits, People can learn to critically think and accept nuance. It's not a life sentence.
And every once in a while, you see people who others label as cranks turn out to be correct. These people are not cranks. They're even more tragic. They're Cassandras. In Greek myth, Princess Cassandra was cursed. She could see the future, the soldiers climbing from the flank of the wooden horse sent into Troy. But those around her would never believe her dire predictions, until it was too late. For what it's worth, most cranks probably think they're Cassandras.
Kevin and I have talked to a lot of cranks over the years. They're unhelpful. Their theories can actually do real harm to real people. But how do you spot a crank? Especially if you're trying to be open-minded while reading about crimes in a poorly moderated online space where facts are served up with a healthy scoop of balderdash on the best day. Believe it or not, it's not a tonal or presentation thing.
You might talk to someone who's a bit unpolished and cantankerous, who is speaking the truth.
On the flip side, I remember we once talked to a woman who certainly qualifies as a crank. She was put together, articulate, and very pleasant. But as we talked to her, we felt ourselves growing more and more uncomfortable because what she was saying was pure conjecture, at best, stated confidently as absolute facts. And she would not brook any questions about her narrative that she was trying to set up.
We put together a little checklist about identifying cranks.
1. Cranks promise big and deliver very little. A crank will reach out to you promising to blow the whole lid off the operation. Then you'll ask for evidence or their source or anything you can grab a hold of and check yourself. And they suddenly get quiet or coy or suspicious. Why do you want to know? Don't you just trust them? They ask defensively. Well, that defensiveness is a classic crank move. Whistleblowers show up with information. Cranks write checks they can't cash. Cranks also cite questionable evidence or leap to conclusions. Cranks often go based off their gut, not based off of evidence. That means that they often are overly reliant on things like criminal profiling or bad vibes or body language. Cranks play games when you ask for follow-up information. But in general, you have to look out for those big, sweeping claims that are not fully backed up by their evidence.
2. Cranks often say they're the only one speaking the truth. In other words, you can't trust anyone other than them. Don't trust the cops. Don't trust the media. Don't trust the politicians. Because anyone who disagrees with the crank is themselves part of the conspiracy. So a crank is extremely quick to smear others.
3. Cranks engage in black and white thinking. According to a crank, anyone who doesn't agree with their thinking might be, quote, in on it or just a foolish dupe. Cranks often unilaterally dismiss alternative and mundane explanations for events in true crime. By adopting such a stark worldview, cranks are actually seeking to comfort themselves and others. Sometimes bad things just happen, but according to a crank, it must be a conspiracy. It can't just be a random negative event.
4. Cranks have limited access to a case. Generally speaking, they have few, if any, sources with legitimate knowledge of a case. And they don't talk to anybody with legitimate knowledge of a case. People whose opinions or experiences may contradict the worldview of the crank. Or if they do talk to such people, they quickly become actively hostile to those sources. Now, all of that being said, they do strive to cultivate media connections, and they may even succeed when the media figures fail to do their own research.
5. Cranks do not accept coincidences. Kismet, fate. Things happen. Kevin and I both met the love of our lives on newspapers.com because we both happened to be researching the same case. Coincidences are weird and should always be looked into. I remember that a while back we interviewed Michael Arntfield. I'll include the link to that episode in our show notes. He talked about a situation where there was the explosion of a plane, and essentially you had 4 or 5 people on said plane where they would have potentially fit a pretty good profile of the bomber who destroyed the plane. One person was very into explosives. One had a very disturbed personal life and had recently taken out insurance. There were all these different coincidences that it almost became impossible to decipher who is the person who did this. Cranks have a very hard time accepting that sometimes there just is a lack of answers.
All of this is bad. The devastation wrought by a crank can be horrible. Cranks have the power to hurt and smear people, to damage the public's understanding of a crime case, and to destroy lives. And frankly, these are cases where intentions do not matter. It doesn't matter if a crank sees themselves as an intrepid citizen sleuth. They are still poisoning the conversation.
Unfortunately, there's very little repercussion for most cranks. Pop onto a poorly moderated subreddit and lie your butt off and see what happens to you. The answer is nothing. You can be wrong 1,000,000 times, but some people will always come back to you because they will consume anything about a case they care about, or they've adopted your crankish ways.
How do we stop the cranks? Well, we can't, not really. But we can disengage, which is still a good idea. We can leave their Facebook groups. We don't support their projects, be they podcasts or channels or books or whatever. We don't watch them as a guilty pleasure or check in on them to laugh at their stupidity. We ignore them. When cranks are mainstreamed, we push back. We ask duped journalists and outlets what the heck they are thinking. When cranks insert themselves into cases to the point where they're having undue influence, we expose their activities through journalism. And we support reputable journalists and outlets doing good work.
We're going to go off script a minute to talk a bit about cranks. Now, Kevin, it's fair to say that this is a topic that I've long wanted to talk about on the Murder Sheet, because I think a lot of people who maybe listen to true crime podcasts and consume true crime products, but are not actually like creating in this field, don't necessarily realize, and why would they, how bad of a problem it is on the internet, that the true crime cranks that basically attempt to insert themselves into cases and promote conspiracy theories from within and attempt to basically hijack narratives. It's actually appalling.
Yeah, and certainly we have had a lot of experience with that ourselves because we regularly receive messages in our inbox from cranks.
Scores of emails. And we tried to clarify up top that we're not just talking about people who are unpolished or maybe have an unpopular opinion. I think there's plenty of people who fit those categories. I mean, we have unpopular opinions sometimes. I think it's about being willing to engage with the facts. And what we're talking about is much more stark. This is people who are just actively peddling nonsense for strange reasons, I think. And I mean, the internet has made this obviously so much worse because before, most of the time, a crank was not going to be able to purchase a major newspaper and start putting out their nonsense. But I mean, anyone can get an email address. Anyone can get a hold of a naive journalist or YouTuber and go on and just lie or make stuff up. And that can have a bit of an impact.
And I think one thing that's important to remember is that the stories and stuff they tell are about real people. When we're consuming true crime, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that the people involved are almost like characters in a story. And when you read a good mystery novel or whatever, you often try to come up with different theories for what's going on. And in that sort of context, it's perfectly reasonable to think, oh, maybe it was Mrs. White in the kitchen with a candlestick. Oh, what if it was corn and mustard? And that's fine. And it's fine to have these conversations in private as well. But when you are going online and saying, well, oh, I think the actual guilty party is the victim's husband because of this or that crazy theory, you're really smearing innocent people without reason.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the term empathy gets thrown around a lot in true crime spaces, but I don't really feel like it means anything unless you actually think about it this way. I try to put myself in the position of what if something awful happened to you in a crime case? What if you were murdered? And how would I feel if then I was going on these different social media sites trying to perhaps raise awareness myself of the case or trying to look for information? And I'm seeing people kind of stroke their mustaches and say, but what if it was her? Think about the horror. Think about the horror of that. And I think you're right. If you're chatting with your friends at Starbucks and kind of casually saying, okay, well, I have some suspicions of the husband. I think that's a different thing than when you're going out and trying to spread this stuff. But I would say that the cranks actually rise above just speculation. I think someone can maybe irresponsibly speculate about things online and not be a crank. They're possibly just curious and not really being super empathetic in how they go about that. But I think the cranks are the people who basically then adopt said theories despite evidence and keep on trying to hawk them to people. There's almost like a salesman-esque character here. I mean, and we've gotten so much of that in Delphi mostly, I would say, but I think this is going to be unfortunately a scourge of true crime for years to come because there's just no repercussions. And unfortunately, you and I have both seen instances where mainstream media outlets actually get rolled by these people. They somehow manage to talk their way into an article, onto TV, and spread their nonsense. And it's just kind of like, okay, that's not good. It's not that those outlets necessarily want to do any harm, but they're just thinking about it from, oh, this is interesting.
Exactly. That's very important to remember. And one thing that's very frustrating is that a lot of these theories they come up with don't have any supporting evidence other than their firm belief in them. So
it sounds right.
We often get messages from people who say, here is what happened, with no evidence to support it. And then if we asked for evidence, they get upset with us. They want us just to go on the show and basically air out their theory of what happened.
Yeah, and it's like, we don't care what you have to say. Like, you're not important to this case. You know, if you want to be a little armchair detective, that's fine, but we literally don't care. You have to give us something. We need something more than just your opinion.
No one cares about anyone's opinion unless it's backed up by evidence.
Yeah. I mean, that's harsh, but that's what they hate to hear that, and they get offended. And I just think that whatever their energy they're using into that space could probably be better put into something else. You know, but I mean, this is the other thing. People who are not cranks then will oftentimes do some of their work. Oh, did you see what this person put out there? You know, this, and it's usually like some bonkers theory. You know, are you going to cover that? And the answer is no, because we don't feel the need to chase after every stupid theory that somebody puts online, because it's not worth our time and it's not worth our audience's time. It's just not. If there's something that rises to the level of like, we should debunk this, then that's a careful consideration, because frankly, just by talking about it, we could potentially be bringing it to more people who may, you know, uncritically think, oh, well, they're mentioning it, so it must be in serious contention. And that's why it's such a complicated calculus about what you even address, even if it's just a debunking. And there's so much out there that's truly just so ridiculous that it's just not worth repeating. It's worth ignoring. And I wish more people would kind of get that and get that there is a time to debunk. There is a time to platform people who you might think are bad or disagree with, just so you can get them on the record. But there's also a time to just simply put it aside and ignore it, and not be like going around telling everybody about it, because you're just doing advertising work for cranks.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I know sometimes you feel I'm a little bit too apt to give some of my time to them.
Yes.
I've adopted a policy now where if someone sends a message indicating here's what happened, here's the real story, I will now typically send them an email back saying, that sounds great. Now give us the evidence. And 99 times out of 100, I never get a response to that question. And
then sometimes you get a response that actually makes us say, hey, let's talk to this person. They seem to have something. Or at the very least, they're open to discussion. They're not a crank. They're not baked in their worldview and offended by anybody who dares question them. That's usually someone who maybe wrote an inelegant first email, but, you know, that doesn't make them a crank. But yeah, typically this stuff falls apart the second you start asking for evidence. I mean, we've had cases where people have actually chased mainstream reporters at different outlets, and everybody just recognizes that they're mentally imbalanced or a total crank. And it's a situation where then they get like super offended and they just, keep coming at you, and they get, then suddenly it's a conspiracy. Everyone's ignoring me because they're all in on it. And it's like, or maybe you just are a crank and nobody takes you seriously at all. I mean, that's also a possibility. But these are usually not the people who are like balanced enough to have some sort of self-reflection of like, how am I coming across? Or, maybe my theories are kind of crazy. So, I just think I wanted to talk about this because I feel like this will be such a problem for years to come in true crime. I don't think this is going away. I think it's going to get worse. Delphi attracted a lot of cranks because it's such a high profile case and because it went unsolved for years. So there was room for people to come in. There was room for healthy speculation. Most of what happened, I think, was probably within the realm of, okay, speculation. Is this a serial killer? Could it be this person who did it, who was like, also a murderer? And then some of it verged into totally unhealthy and inappropriate speculation, throwing shade at the families, intruding on people's lives. And then this crankdom where it's like, I have this very specific theory, and if you disagree with me, then I'm going to fight you. And I'm going to try to just sell this to anybody who will buy it.
Yeah, and one crucial factor in Delphi that made it unusually vulnerable to cranks was the lack of information put out by legitimate sources. Because the breeding ground for cranks, what they thrive on is lack of legitimate information. Because the less that is really known and confirmed, that gives you more room to speculate and to come up with ridiculous theories saying, oh, it was actually the president's daughter's sister or something that was there that day.
They're like mildew. If you open the light up and you get some bleach and start going at it, then, they clear up. But dark, dank, closed spaces, they're going to thrive in. And it's just not a good thing. And I feel like I know a lot of our audience is very media literate, and they understand that not all information on the internet is created equal. In fact, some of it's just garbage, and then some of it's, worth considering, and then some of it is good. I think people in our audience get that, but I see a lot of other situations within true crime where I'm like, people maybe generally have some difficulties grasping that. And I get it because it's complicated. And also, I know like before I started on the crime beat, when I was just a consumer, there was a bit of a attitude with me at times, I think, where I would be like, well, I'm interested in this case, and I've read all the mainstream stuff, and there's not a lot of it. So, I mean, why don't I just check out this YouTube where this guy's talking about it? Or why don't I just check out this podcast? You get sucked in that way because you're like, I'll just try it. But then suddenly like they're peddling something really crazy, and you're kind of like, wait, I'm like 3 videos in. What am I doing? And I think like that's probably something a lot of people can relate to. It doesn't mean anybody's stupid. I don't consider myself a stupid person, but it gets you regardless of whether or not you're smart. I'd actually say smart people are probably more susceptible to it in some ways, because you kind of think, oh, well, I'm not going to be duped. And then like suddenly you're consuming all this stuff that's nonsense. And then, you gotta wonder, what am I doing here?
Yeah. One thing to remember as a consumer is that I think it's natural for all of us to be more interested in a speaker who really seems to know what they're talking about. If a person comes out and firmly says something, I know that this is true, I have no doubts about it, and is very firm and very persuasive, there can be something appealing about that. That can certainly be more appealing than listening to someone saying, well, I don't really know about this, but it's possible that this happened or this happened. And the problem there is that when it comes to cranks, they are always absolutely certain. And often it's the people who express doubts and uncertainty. Those are the people you should be listening to.
Radley Balko said that, but in the context of witnesses in a criminal case. Sometimes forensic examiners, in his view, overstate their case, and they're very confident, here's exactly what happened. But that other witnesses might be like, well, we can't quite be sure, and then they're discarded. So yeah, it's so true that if you're that certain, then you should be that much more scrutinized, in my opinion, because You're just putting out something there that, as fact that may not be settled. And especially in a case where, I mean, so many people come up to us sometimes in different settings, and they're like going on and on about something. And you're just like, you have no idea about this case, and you obviously don't talk to anybody connected with it because you're just saying things that are not the case. They're not true. And, and then when you're going out and then having a very hard and fast opinion about something, it's very difficult for me to take that seriously, because it's like you've already demonstrated just by what you're saying that you have no idea what you're talking about. I think that's been something. I don't think you really reach crank level, though, for me, until it becomes a evangelical, essentially, like you're evangelizing your own viewpoint, going out and spreading the good word to everybody, the email that you can find on the internet. I really feel like we all have to be kind of wary about this stuff going forward, because, as we said, it can ruin lives. It can mess up a case. I mean, in the sense that if you're basically misinforming everybody and that misinformation becomes very mainstream, that can affect outcomes, unfortunately. I think that cranks have been around forever. I think it's just a matter of them getting platformed by the internet. Obviously, we love the, for lack of a better term, democratization of aspects of the media. We're able to do a podcast because of that. So we're very grateful for that. But there is a downside to that. And that means that anybody can essentially do anything. And sometimes having gatekeepers is very exclusionary and damaging, and it makes some voices not heard in a way that's bad. And then other times it's keeping out people who are just either, dead wrong, stupid, or malicious. It's good to keep those people out, but they're in now. And I think the thing to do is for us all to just be very savvy and media literate about dealing with them in true crime spaces. And kind of figuring out, like, what is this person selling? Why are they doing this? Is the evidence bolstering their confidence, or is the confidence not really based on anything? Are they willing to brook any dissent? Curious, Kevin, like, when's the first time you kind of became aware of true crime cranks?
I was always interested in the subject of cranks in general from the time I was a kid, over and above true crime cranks. When I was a kid, I was very interested in things like UFOs or messages from the dead or monsters like Bigfoot. And even as a kid, I realized those were very unlikely to be true, but I wanted them to be true. I think in terms of cranks in the true crime space, maybe it was cases either like JFK or perhaps the Lindbergh kidnapping.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's another, I think we can close on this. You highlight on a really good point that part of it is the audience's wish for it to be true, or wish to get new information, or wish to have a case solved. That fuels a crank, because if there isn't that need, then if there isn't that demand, then it seems like the supply is harder to put together.
So, does our disdain for cranks mean that we should just uncritically swallow mainstream talking points at all times? No, absolutely not. We should always remain skeptical and curious when looking into crimes. It's better to be skeptical and curious than crankish. So that means scrutinizing statements and information from just about everyone: police, the prosecution, the defense, activists, families, and more.
Skeptical people have doubts and reservations by nature, but curious people are open-minded, and they don't jump to conclusions. They're flexible. When they're handed a half-complete illustration of a crime, they don't doodle their own background details to suit their own biases and assumptions. They say, I don't know a lot. They hedge. They identify facts, and they identify speculation. They talk to everyone.
Be skeptical. We live in a fallen world. Humans are capable of tremendous cruelty. Corruption exists. Some conspiracies turn out to be real. Those are rarely the ones that get talked about, though.
Always remember, the absolute vast majority of conspiracy theorists and cranks are not Cassandra. They are not weeping and tearing their hair trying to convince others of a very real and very dismal truth. They're more like some ancient fool rending their tunic and screaming about how King Priam is covering up that Hector wasn't killed by Achilles in single combat. He was murdered by a team of Dardanian hitmen. The crank raves about nothing as Troy burns. Or worse, they're the big, dumb wooden horse with disaster in its belly.
Thanks so much for listening to the Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.